Judge Morita, a black woman, never expected to be mistaken for a trespasser in her own courtroom when Officer Blake blocked her from entering, but just 3 minutes later, karma strikes back in a way Officer Blake never saw coming. Will this unexpected confrontation force him to rethink his views on justice? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Just Morita King stood before her bedroom mirror. Carefully adjusting her black robe, her fingers smoothed out the creases, each movement deliberate and purposeful. The weight of the garment seemed heavier today, as if it carried the hopes and fears of an entire community on its shoulders. Morita took a deep breath, her dark eyes meeting their reflection at her late 30s. Her face showed the lines of wisdom earned through years of service to justice. Another day, she whispered to herself, another chance to make things right. The morning sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting a warm glow on the room. Morita's gaze drifted to the framed photo on her dresser, a picture of her grandmother who had marched for civil rights decades ago. The image brought a small smile to her lips, reminding her of the legacy she carried. As she gathered her briefcase, Morita's mind turned to the case awaiting her. It was a landmark civil rights lawsuit, one that could set a precedent for years to come. The weight of responsibility settled in her chest, a familiar but always sobering feeling. Morita made her way downstairs, her footsteps echoing in the quiet house. In the kitchen, she poured herself a cup of coffee, savoring the rich aroma. It was a small moment of calm before the storm that lay ahead. Sitting at her kitchen table, Morita opened her briefcase and reviewed her notes one last time. The facts of the case danced before her eyes, each detail crucial. She thought about the people involved, the plaintiffs seeking justice, the defendants facing accusations, the attorneys on both sides. In her mind, they were all equal before the law, deserving of fair treatment and unbiased judgment. Lord, Morita prayed softly, closing her eyes, guide my thoughts and decisions today. Let me be a vessel for your justice and compassion. And she finished her coffee. Morita's resolve strengthened. She knew the day ahead would be challenging, filled with intense arguments and emotional testimonies. But she also knew that this was her calling, to stand as a beacon of fairness in a world that often fell short. Morita gathered her things and headed for the door. As she stepped outside, the morning air crisp against her face, she paused for a moment. The neighborhood was quiet, most people still asleep or just beginning their day. But for Morita, the most important work of her life was about to begin. With a deep breath, she walked to her car, ready to face whatever the day might bring. The weight of her role as a judge, as a black woman in a position of power, as a guardian of justice, it all rested on her shoulders. But Morita King stood tall, her spirit unbroken, her commitment unwavering. As she drove towards the courthouse, Morita's mind focused on the task ahead. She knew that her decisions today could change lives, shape policies, and push society towards greater equality. It was a responsibility she didn't take lightly, but one she embraced with all her heart. Officer Blake stood at attention outside the courthouse, his crisp blue uniform a stark contrast to the weathered stone steps. At 25, he was the newest addition to the precinct, and his eagerness showed in every movement. His eyes darted back and forth, scanning the crowd with an intensity that bordered on overzealous. First day on courthouse duty, rookie, a passing senior officer asked with a smirk. Blake straightened his back even more. If that was possible. Yes, sir, ready to serve and protect. The older officer chuckled and moved on, leaving Blake to his post. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. This was his chance to prove himself, to show everyone that he was cut out for this job. As people began to arrive for the day's proceedings, Blake watched them closely. He couldn't shake the feeling that danger could be lurking anywhere. His hand unconsciously brushed against his holster, reassuring himself that he was prepared for anything. A group of young black men approached, talking animatedly among themselves. Blake felt his muscles tense. Without realizing it, his hand moved closer to his weapon. He watched them carefully as they passed, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. Keep it together, Blake, he muttered to himself. You're here to protect everyone. But as more people of color arrived, Blake found himself on edge. He didn't want to admit it even to himself, but he was treating them differently. His gaze lingered longer, his posture became more rigid, and his hand never strayed far from his gun. An older white woman stumbled on the steps, and Blake rushed to help her. Are you all right, ma'am? He asked, his voice full of concern. Oh, thank you, officer, she said with a grateful smile. It's so nice to see such a fine young man protecting us. Blake beamed at the compliment, standing a little taller. This was why he had become a police officer, to help people, to make a difference. As the morning wore on, Blake's sense of duty only grew stronger. He felt important, necessary. Every person who passed by was a potential threat in his mind, but also someone he was sworn to protect. The weight of his responsibility settled on his shoulders, and he embraced it fully. Little did Blake know that his actions, his subtle shifts and behavior were not going unnoticed. His biases, deeply ingrained and unexamined, were shaping his interactions with everyone who approached the courthouse. But in his mind he was simply doing his job, being the best officer he could be. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, Judge Marita King made her way towards the courthouse. Her casual attire was a stark contrast to the formal robes folded neatly over her arm. She walked with purpose, her mind already on the day's proceedings. Officer Blake, still on high alert, spotted Marita from a distance. His eyes narrowed as he watched her approach. Something about her didn't sit right with him. She didn't look like she belonged here. As Marita neared the steps, Blake stepped forward, his posture stiff and authoritative. "Excuse me, ma'am," he called out, his voice sharp. "Where do you think you're going?" Marita paused, surprised by the confrontation. "I'm heading into the courthouse," she replied calmly, gesturing towards the building. Blake's suspicion grew. He moved closer, his hand instinctively resting on his belt. "I'm going to need to see some identification," he demanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. Marita's brow furrowed. She'd left her ID in her chambers, not expecting to need it. "I'm sorry, officer, but I don't have my ID on me at the moment. I'm Judge." "A likely story," Blake cut her off, his voice rising. "You expect me to believe you're a judge?" Marita took a deep breath, trying to maintain her composure. "Officer, if you'll just let me explain." But Blake wasn't listening. His face had hardened, his preconceived notions taking over. "You have no business is here," he said, his voice cold. "This is a restricted area. You're trespassing." Marita stood her ground, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to Blake's growing hostility. "Officer, there's been a misunderstanding. If you'll just know you don't get to explain." Blake interrupted again, his voice echoing off the courthouse walls. "You need to leave now or I'll have to take action." The situation was escalating quickly. Passers-by began to slow down, watching the confrontation unfold. Marita could feel their eyes on her, could sense the tension building in the air. She clutched her robes tighter, a physical reminder of who she was and why she was here. Blake took another step forward, his face twisted with anger and suspicion. "I won't tell you again," he growled. "Show me some ID or leave the premises immediately." As the tension mounted, Marita took another deep breath, determined to remain calm. "Officer Blake," she said, her voice steady and clear, "I understand your concern, but I assure you I am Judge Marita King. I'm presiding over a case today in this very courthouse." Blake scoffed, his disbelief evident in every line of his face. "Lady, anyone can claim to be a judge. Where's your proof?" By now a small crowd had begun to gather around them. Whispers rippled through the onlookers, some recognizing Judge King, others simply curious about the unfolding drama. Marita gestured to her robes. "These are my judicial robes. I was planning to change once I reached my chambers." But Blake wasn't having it, his face reneged as his frustration grew. "Those could be a costume for all I know," he snapped. "You're not getting in without proper ID." A few people in the crowd started to murmur, recognizing Judge King. One woman stepped forward hesitantly. "Officer, I think that really is." "Stay out of this, ma'am," Blake barked, cutting her off. He turned back to Marita, his voice rising. "You're being uncooperative. I'm going to have to ask you to leave immediately." Marita stood her ground, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to Blake's agitation. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but this is a misunderstanding. If we could just—" "That's it," Blake interrupted, reaching for his radio. "I'm calling for backup. You had your chance to cooperate." The crowd grew larger, more voices joining in, trying to explain who Marita was, but Blake was too caught up in his own assumptions to listen. His hand shook slightly as he gripped his radio, his eyes never leaving Marita. "Officer, please." Marita tried one last time, her voice firm but kindly. "And take a moment to back up," requested. At the courthouse steps, Blake spoke into his radio, ignoring Marita's words. "We have an uncooperative individual refusing to leave the premises." The tension in the air was palpable. Marita stood tall, her dignity intact despite the humiliation of the situation. She looked around at the concerned faces in the crowd, then back at Officer Blake, whose anger seemed to be masking a growing uncertainty as they waited for backup to arrive. The whispers in the crowd grew louder. More people were recognizing Judge King, their voices rising in protest against Blake's treatment of her. But Blake, caught up in his own narrative, refused to hear them. As the tension reached its peak, Marita slowly reached into her pocket. The crowd held its breath, and even Officer Blake's hand hovered uncertainly over his weapon. With deliberate movements, she pulled out a small leather wallet and flipped it open. "Officer Blake," she said calmly, "I believe this is what you've been asking for." There, nestled in the wallet, was her judicial badge, gleaming in the morning sunlight. Blake's eyes widened as he stared at the unmistakable proof of Marita's identity. The color drained from Blake's face, only to be quickly replaced by a deep burning red that spread from his neck to his hairline. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The reality of his mistake crashed over him like a tidal wave. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, growing louder as people realized what had just transpired. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others voiced their outrage at Blake's treatment of Judge King. Blake stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating in an instant. He looked around, suddenly aware of the dozens of eyes watching him, the weight of his actions pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. "Judge King, I didn't." Blake's words tumbled out in a jumbled mess. He swallowed hard, trying to regain his composure. "I'm deeply sorry, Your Honor. I shouldn't have." Marita stood tall, her dignity unshaken by the ordeal. She looked at Blake not with anger but with a mixture of understanding and disappointment. The young officer seemed to shrink under her gaze. "Officer Blake," Marita said, her voice clear and steady, "you still have much to learn about." Just as Officer Blake stood rooted to the courthouse steps, his body rigid and his mind reeling, the crowd slowly dispersed, but their disapproving glances and hushed whispers lingered in the air like a heavy fog. He watched Judge King's retreating figure, her dignified posture, a stark contrast to his own slumped shoulders as the adrenaline of the confrontation faded. A wave of guilt crashed over Blake, his stomach churned, and he felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. "What have I done?" he thought. His inner voice filled with self-flow. Blake's mind raced, replaying the encounter over and over. He saw himself through new eyes, not as the dutiful officer he'd imagined, but as someone who had jumped to conclusions based on nothing more than appearance. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. "I didn't even give her a chance," he mumbled to himself, running a shaky hand through his hair. "I just assumed." The weight of his actions pressed down on him. He thought about how quickly he had judged Judge King, how easily he had dismissed her explanation. Blake's cheeks burned with shame as he remembered the hostility in his voice, the threatening posture he had taken. What if it had escalated? The thought sent a chill down his spine. He realized how close he had come to making a terrible mistake, one that could have had serious consequences for both Judge King and himself. Blake's training at the academy flashed through his mind. He remembered lectures on community policing, on treating everyone with respect. But when faced with a real-world situation, he had fallen back on his own biases, seeing threat where there was none. As he stood there grappling with his guilt, Blake began to question other assumptions he had made in his short time on the force. How many times had he judged someone based on their skin color or the way they dressed? How often had he let his preconceptions guide his actions? The young officer felt a deep sense of disappointment in himself. He had always prided himself on being fair and just, but this incident had shattered that self-image. Blake realized he had a long way to go in understanding his own biases and how they affected his work. Officer Blake remained frozen on the courthouse steps, his mind a whirlwind of regret and self-doubt. He barely noticed the bustling activity around him as people continued to enter and exit the building. His eyes were fixed on the ground, unseeing as he replayed the confrontation with Judge King over and over in his head. Suddenly a firm hand clasped his shoulder, jolting him back to reality. Blake looked up to see Officer Harris, a seasoned veteran on the force, standing beside him with a grim expression. "Blake, we need to talk," Harris said, his voice low and serious. Blake's stomach dropped. He knew Harris had been stationed nearby during the incident. A fresh wave of shame washed over him as he realized his colleague had witnessed the entire exchange. Harris guided Blake to a quiet corner away from prying eyes and ears. What happened back there was unacceptable. He began, his disappointment evident in every word. "I've already called it in to the head office." Blake's eyes widened in shock. You reported me," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Harris nodded solemnly. "I had to." "Blake, what you did was discriminatory. It goes against everything we stand for as officers of the law." The weight of Harris' words hit Blake like a ton of bricks. He had been so caught up in his personal guilt that he hadn't even considered the professional ramifications of his actions. Now faced with the reality of a formal report, Blake felt a new kind of fear grip him. I didn't mean to," Blake began, but Harris cut him off with a raised hand. "Intent doesn't matter here, Blake. What matters is your actions. You profiled a respected judge based on her appearance. That's not just a mistake. It's a serious breach of conduct." Blake's mind raced, trying to grasp the full implications of what was happening. He had always dreamed of being a good cop, of making a difference. Now, in just a few short minutes, he had not only betrayed those ideals but potentially jeopardized his entire career. "What's going to happen now?" Blake asked, his voice trembling slightly. Harris sighed, his expression softening slightly at the sight of the young officer's distress. "I don't know for sure. There will likely be an investigation. You might face disciplinary action, maybe even suspension." The possibility of suspension hit Blake hard. He felt as if the ground was crumbling beneath his feet. Everything he had worked for, all his ambitions, now hung in the balance because of one terrible lapse in judgment. As Blake stood there grappling with the weight of his actions, his radio crackled to life. The voice of his sergeant cut through the static, summoning him into the precinct office. Immediately, with a heavy heart, Blake made his way to the station, each step feeling like lead. Inside the sergeant's office, Blake found himself face to face with a stern-looking superior. The sergeant's expression was a mix of disappointment and frustration as he delivered the news. "Officer Blake, we've received a formal complaint about your conduct outside the courthouse this morning." The sergeant began, his voice Firm an investigation into racial discrimination will be launched immediately. Blake's stomach churned. He had known this was coming, but hearing it officially made it all too real. The sergeant continued outlining the seriousness of the allegations and the potential consequences Blake might face. For now you're to remain on duty, the sergeant said, but we'll be keeping a close eye on you. Any further incidents will result in immediate suspension. Blake nodded numbly, unable to find words. Just as he thought the worst was over, the sergeant dealt one final blow. For the remainder of the day you're reassigned. You'll be providing security inside Judge Marita King's courtroom. Blake's head snapped up, his eyes wide with disbelief. But sir, he stammered, after what happened. The sergeant cut him off with a raised hand. This isn't a punishment, Blake, it's an opportunity. Learn from it. As Blake left the office, a sense of dread settled over him like a heavy blanket. The thought of facing Judge King again, of standing in her courtroom after what he had done, filled him with anxiety. He knew he deserved this discomfort, but it didn't make it any easier to bear. With each step towards the courthouse, Blake's apprehension grew. He couldn't help but wonder how Judge King would react to his presence, or if she would even acknowledge him at all. The shame of their earlier encounter burned fresh in his mind as he approached the courtroom doors. Taking a deep breath, Blake steeled himself and pushed the doors open, stepping into the room where he would spend the rest of his day under the watchful eye of the very woman he had wronged. Blakey entered Judge Marita King's courtroom, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was already buzzing with activity, filled with lawyers, spectators, and court officials. He took his position near the back, trying to blend into the background as much as possible. As the bailiff called for everyone to rise, Judge King entered the room. Blake watched in awe as she walked to the bench. With a calm, dignified air, her presence commanded respect, and the entire courtroom fell silent. You may be seated, Judge King said, her voice clear and authoritative. Blake struggled to focus on his security duties. His mind kept replaying the morning's incident, filling him with waves of shame and regret. He forced himself to scan the room, looking for any potential disturbances, but his gaze kept drifting back to Judge King. The first case of the day was called the State vs. Nell Williams. The court clerk announced. A young black woman stood up from the defendant's table. She looked nervous, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Blake couldn't help but notice how young and vulnerable she appeared. Miss Williams is accused of theft from Morton's department store. The prosecutor began. We have video evidence of her leaving the store with unpaid merchandise. Judge King listened intently, her expression neutral. She turned to knock defense attorney. And how does your client plead not guilty, Your Honor? The defense attorney replied, we contend that this is a case of mistaken identity. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Blake could feel the weight of the moment. Understanding now more than ever the importance of fair and unbiased justice, he watched as Judge King carefully considered each word spoken, her demeanor calm and thoughtful. As the proceedings continued, Blake found himself drawn into the case. He listened to the testimonies, watched the faces of the jury, and observed Judge King's masterful handling of the courtroom. Despite his earlier mistake, he couldn't help but feel a growing respect for her professionalism and wisdom. Throughout the morning, Blake's focus sharpened. He began to see beyond his own guilt and truly understand the gravity of his role in the justice system. Every decision, every action could have profound consequences on people's lives. As he stood there witnessing justice in action, Blake realized that this experience was more than just a punishment or a lesson. It was an opportunity for growth, a chance to see the world through a different lens, and as he watched Judge King preside over the case with grace and fairness, he knew that he had a long way to go. But he was determined to learn. As the trial unfolded, Blake found himself drawn deeper into the proceedings. He watched intently as Judge King navigated the complex web of testimonies and evidence with remarkable skill and patience. The prosecution presented their case relying heavily on witness statements and security footage. However, as Judge King began to question the witnesses, cracks in their testimony started to appear. Mr. Johnson, Judge King addressed one of the store's security guards. You stated that you saw Miss Williams leaving the store with unpaid merchandise. Can you describe exactly what you saw? The guard shifted uncomfortably. Well, Your Honor, I saw a young black woman exiting the store quickly. She looked suspicious. Judge King eyebrow raised slightly. And what specifically made her look suspicious to you? The guard stumbled over his words. She didn't look like she belonged there, if you know what I mean. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Blake felt a knot form in his stomach as he recognized the same bias he had shown earlier that day. As the trial continued, Judge King methodically exposed the flaws in the prosecution's case. The security footage upon closer inspection was grainy and inconclusive. The witness statements were vague and riddled with assumptions. Blake watched in awe as Judge King addressed directly. Miss Williams, can you tell the court where you were on the day in question? Knock voice trembled slightly as she spoke. I was at the store, Your Honor. I was shopping for a gift for my mother's birthday. But I didn't steal anything. I left because I felt uncomfortable with how the staff was watching me. Judge King nodded, her expression compassionate yet neutral. Thank you, Miss Williams. As the hours passed, Blake couldn't help but draw parallels between Na's case and his own encounter with Judge King. He realized with growing discomfort how easily he had jumped to conclusions based solely on appearance. The weight of his earlier actions pressed heavily on his conscience as the courtroom settled after the verdict. Judge Marita King took a deep breath. Her eyes swept across the room, taking in the faces of those present, the relieved defendant, the stunned prosecutors, and the attentive spectators. Her gaze lingered for a moment on Officer Blake, who stood rigidly at attention near the door. Before we conclude today's proceedings, Marita began, her voice calm yet resonant, I feel compelled to address the broader implications of this case. The courtroom fell silent, all eyes fixed on the judge. What we've witnessed here today is not just about one individual. It's a stark reminder of the pervasive issues that continue to plague our justice system. Marita continued, her words measured and clear. Racial profiling and discrimination have no place in a society that claims to value justice and equality. Blake felt his chest tighten as Marita's words hit home. He found himself hanging on every word, unable to look away. Ms. Williams was subjected to suspicion, arrest, and prosecution based largely on assumptions tied to her race. This is not justice. This is the very antithesis of what our legal system should represent, Marita declared, her voice gaining strength. She turned her attention to the prosecution table. To my colleagues in the legal profession, I implore you to examine your practices critically. We must be vigilant against allowing biases, conscious or unconscious, to influence our judgment and actions. The consequences of such biases, as we've seen today, can be devastating to innocent individuals and corrosive to the public's trust in our institutions. Blake felt a wave of shame wash over him. He saw his own actions from that morning reflected in the case before him. The realization of how quickly he had judged Judge King based solely on her appearance hit him with renewed force. Marita's voice softened slightly, but her words remained powerful. To Miss Williams, the first, extend my deepest apologies on behalf of the system that has failed you. Your innocence was never in question. It was our own prejudices that were on trial today. Na, seated at the defendant's table, wiped away a tear, nodding in gratitude. Let this case serve as a wake-up call. Merit continued, her gaze sweeping the courtroom once more. We must do better. We must be better. The pursuit of true justice demands nothing less from each of us. As Marita concluded her statement, a profound silence fell over the courtroom. The weight of her words hung in the air, challenging everyone present to reflect on their own biases and actions. Blake stood motionless, feeling as though Marita's words had been directed specifically at him. The parallels between his earlier behavior and the injustice Na had faced were undeniable. He felt a mix of shame and a growing determination to confront his own biases. Heeding Judge King's voice cut through Blake's thoughts. In light of the evidence presented, or rather the lack thereof, I find that there is insufficient cause to proceed with this case. Miss Williams, you are free to go. Case dismissed. The courtroom erupted in a mix of reactions. Nina's family embraced her, tears of relief streaming down their faces. The prosecutors looked stunned, shuffling their papers in disbelief. Blake stood rooted to his spot, his mind reeling. He had just witnessed firsthand how racial profiling and hasty judgments could have devastating consequences. The parallels between Nina's case and his own actions that morning were undeniable. He felt a deep sense of shame, but also a glimmer of something else. A determination to do better, to be better. As the courtroom emptied, Officer Blake stumbled out into the hallway, his mind swirling with conflicting emotions. The weight of Judge King's words pressed down on him, making each step feel heavy and uncertain. He found a quiet corner and leaned against the wall, closing his eyes as the events of the day replayed in his mind. The image of Judge King approaching the courthouse that morning flashed before him. Blake saw himself through new eyes, not as the dutiful officer he thought he was, but as someone whose actions were fueled by prejudice and assumptions. He remembered the hostility in his voice, the suspicion in his eyes, all directed at a woman who had done nothing wrong. What was I thinking? Blake muttered to himself, shaking his head in disbelief as he stood there. The parallels between his actions and Nina Williams' case became painfully clear. Both situations stemmed from the same route, snap judgments based on race. The realization hit Blake like a punch to the gut, leaving him breathless. He thought about how quickly he had dismissed Judge King's explanation, how readily he had assumed she didn't belong. It was the same bias that had led to Nina's arrest and near conviction. Blake felt a wave of shame wash over him. I'm no better than those officers who arrested Na. He whispered, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. Blake's mind raced as he began to see his actions as part of a larger pattern. It wasn't just about this one incident, it was about a whole system of biases and assumptions that he had been blind to. He realized that his eagerness to prove himself as an officer had blinded him to his own prejudices as he stood there ling with these uncomfortable truths. Blake knew he couldn't ignore this revelation he had to confront his biases even no matter how difficult it might be. The image of Judge King's calm dignity in the face of his hostility haunted him, serving as both a rebuke and an inspiration. "I have to do better," Blake said firmly, straightening up. "I have to be better." The next day Blake sat at his desk staring at the formal notice in his hands. The words "flagged for review" seemed to jump off the page, making his stomach churn. He had known this was coming, but seeing it in black and white made it all too real. "Officer Blake," a voice called out. He looked up to see his supervisor, Captain Johnson, standing in the doorway. "Got a minute?" Blake nodded, his mouth suddenly dry. "Yes, sir." Captain Johnson entered the office and closed the door behind him. He took a seat across from Blake, his expression a mix of concern and disappointment. "I'm sure you know why I'm here," the captain began. "Your actions outside the courthouse have raised some serious concerns." Blake nodded, unable to meet his supervisor's eyes. "I understand, sir." "Look, Blake," Captain Johnson leaned forward, his tone softening slightly. "You're a good officer with potential, but what happened yesterday, it can't be ignored." Blake felt a lump forming in his throat. "Am I being suspended?" Did the captain shook his head. "Not yet. We're offering you an alternative." He slid a brochure across the desk. "There's an anti-bias training program starting next week. If you agree to attend, we can hold off on any disciplinary action for now." Blake picked up the brochure, his mind racing. Part of him felt defensive, wanting to argue that he didn't need this, but the memory of Judge King's face and the realization of his own prejudices stopped him short. I don't know what to say," Blake admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Captain Johnson's expression softened further. "You don't have to decide right now, but Blake, I want you to really think about this. It's an opportunity to grow, to become a better officer." As the captain stood to leave, Blake found himself at a crossroads. The training program felt like an admission of guilt, a public acknowledgement of his failings, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that this might be exactly what he needed. What if Blake started, then hesitated? What if I go through the training and nothing changes? Captain Johnson paused at the door. "Then at least you'll know you tried." "But Blake, change only happens when we're open to it. The question is, are you ready to open your mind?" With that, the captain left, leaving Blake alone with his thoughts. He looked down at the brochure again, feeling a mix of fear and hope. This could be a chance to confront his biases head-on, to become the officer he always thought he was, but it wouldn't be easy. Blake knew he'd have to face some uncomfortable truths about himself. The thought made him nervous but also strangely determined. As he sat there weighing his options, Blake realized that this decision could shape the rest of his career, and more importantly, the kind of person he wanted to be. Blake sat at his desk, the brochure for the anti-bias training program lying open before him. His fingers drummed nervously on the desk as he wrestled with his decision. The weight of his actions outside the courthouse pressed heavily on his conscience, and he knew that this choice could define his future as a police officer. With a deep breath, Blake picked up his phone and dialed the number on the brochure. "Hello," he said, his voice wavering slightly. "This is Officer Blake. I'd like to sign up for the anti-bias training program." As he hung up the phone, a mix of relief and apprehension washed over him. He had taken the first step, but the journey ahead seemed daunting. Across town in her chambers, Judge Marita King was reviewing case files when her phone rang. She answered it, her eyebrows raising in surprise as she listened to the caller. "You want me to lead the anti-bias training program?" she asked, her voice filled with a mixture of honor and responsibility. The voice on the other end explained that her reputation for fairness and her recent experience with Officer Blake made her the ideal candidate to lead the training. Marita sat back in her chair, considering the offer. She thought about the young officer who had confronted her, and how this could be an opportunity to make a real difference in the department. "I would be honored to lead the training," Marita said, her voice firm with conviction. "Thank you for considering me." As she hung up the phone, Marita felt a sense of purpose wash over her. This was a chance to address systemic issues hidden, to help officers like Blake understand the impact of their biases. She began to jot down ideas for the training, drawing from her years of experience in the justice system. Marita knew that this wouldn't be an easy task, but she was determined to create a program that would challenge officers to confront their prejudices and grow. As the day of the training approached, both Blake and Marita prepared themselves for what lay ahead. Blake felt a mix of nervousness and determination, knowing that this could be a turning point in his career and personal growth. Marita, on the other hand, felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders, understanding the importance of the task before her. Little did they know that their paths were about to intersect once again in a way that would profoundly impact them both. As the day of the anti-bias training arrived, Officer Blake walked into the conference room with hesitant steps. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the faces of his fellow officers. Suddenly his gaze locked onto a familiar figure at the front of the room. Judge Marita King stood there, calm and poised, preparing her materials for the training. Blake's heart raced. He hadn't expected to see her here, and the memory of their encounter outside the courthouse flooded back. He considered turning around and leaving, but something kept him rooted to the spot. Marita looked up, her eyes meeting Blake's for a moment. Blake held his breath, unsure of how she would react to his surprise. Marita's face softened into a gentle smile. She walked over to him, her steps measured and graceful. "Officer Blake," she said, her voice warm and free of judgment, "I'm glad to see you here today." Blake swallowed hard, struggling to find his voice. "Judge King, I didn't know you'd be leading the training." Marita nodded, eyes kind. "This is an important step for all of us. I hope we can learn and grow together today." As the training began, Marita's calm demeanor put the room at ease. She started by explaining the concept of implicit bias using simple examples that resonated with the officers. "We all have biases," she explained, her voice clear and steady. "The key is recognizing them and understanding how they affect our actions." Blake listened intently, his mind racing as he began to see his own experiences in a new light. When Marita spoke about systemic racism, he felt a twinge of discomfort, but he forced himself to keep an open mind. As the session progressed, Blake found himself becoming more engaged. He started to raise his hand, asking questions and sharing his thoughts. Each time Marita responded with patience and insight, guiding the conversation without judgment. During a group exercise, Blake found himself self-paired with a black female officer as they discussed their experiences. Blake felt a shift in his perspective. He began to understand the weight of everyday discrimination that his colleague faced. "I never realized," Blake said softly, more to himself than to his partner. As the training wrapped up, Blake felt a mix of emotions, humility, hope, and a newfound determination. He knew this was just the beginning of a long journey, but for the first time he felt ready to face it. As the training progressed, Blake found himself leaning forward in his seat, hanging on to every word Marita spoke. Her calm, measured voice filled the room as she shared real-life examples of racial profiling and its devastating effects. "Let me tell you about a young man named Marcus." Marita began, her eyes scanning the room. "He was pulled over 17 times in 1 year simply for driving while black." Blake felt a knot form in his stomach. He had made similar stops himself, always justifying them as routine checks. Marita continued, "Each time Marcus was forced to exit his vehicle, sometimes at gunpoint. Can you imagine the fear and humiliation he experienced?" The room fell silent. Blake could see the discomfort on his fellow officers' faces, mirroring his own. As Marita shared more cases, Blake's mind raced back to his encounter with her outside the courthouse. He saw his actions in a new light, realizing how quickly he had jumped to conclusions based solely on her appearance. "Now I'd like to share a personal experience," Marita said, her voice softening. She recounted the incident with Blake without mentioning his name. Blake's face burned with shame, but he forced himself to listen. "In that moment, I wasn't seen as a judge or even as a person," Marita explained. "I was reduced to a stereotype, a threat based on nothing more than the color of my skin." Blake's eyes welled up with tears. He blinked them back, determined to face the truth of his actions. As the session moved into group discussions, Blake found himself opening up. He shared his own biases, admitting to assumptions he had made in the past. It wasn't easy, but with each confession he felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. "I never realized how much I needed to unlearn," Blake said to his group. "It's like I've been wearing blinders my whole life and they're finally coming off." Marita, overhearing his comment, gave him an encouraging nod. Blake felt a glimmer of hope. He knew he had a long way to go, but for the first time he was truly ready to change. As the training session came to a close, Blake felt a mix of emotions swirling inside him. His heart raced as he watched Marita gathering her materials at the front of the room. He knew he had to speak with her to express his gratitude, but the thought of facing her again made his palms sweat. Taking a deep breath, Blake slowly made his way through the crowd of dispersing officers. He approached Marita with hesitant steps, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Judge King," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Marita turned to face him, her expression calm and open. "Yes, Officer Blake." Blake swallowed hard, struggling to find the right words. I wanted to thank you for the training today. It was really eye-opening." Marita smiled gently, recognizing the change in Blake's demeanor. The defensive, confrontational officer she had encountered outside the courthouse seemed to have vanished. In his place stood a man who appeared humbled and genuinely affected by what he had learned. "I'm glad you found it helpful," Marita replied warmly. Blake nodded, his eyes finally meeting hers. "It was more than helpful, it was life-changing." He paused, gathering his courage. "I want you to know that the incident with you outside the courthouse, it changed my perspective. I've learned so much about justice and equality, not just today, but since that moment." Marita's smile widened, her eyes filled with understanding. "That's wonderful to hear, Officer Blake. Growth and change are never easy, but they're always worth it." Blake felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had been so afraid of Marita's judgment, but instead he found only kindness and Encouragement. I know I have a long way to go, Blake admitted, his voice stronger now, but I'm committed to doing better, to being better. Thank you for giving me that chance. In the weeks following the anti-bias training, Blake found himself viewing the world through a new lens. Every interaction, every decision became an opportunity for self-reflection. He caught himself making snap judgments and actively worked to challenge those thoughts. One sunny afternoon, Blake was on patrol when he spotted a group of teenagers hanging out in front of a convenience store. His old instincts told him to be suspicious, but he paused, taking a deep breath. He remembered Judge King's words about the dangers of stereotyping. Instead of immediately confronting the teens, Blake approached with a friendly smile. Afternoon, folks, everything okay here? The teenagers, initially tense, visibly relaxed. One of them, a young boy with bright eyes, spoke up. Yes, sir, we're just waiting for our friend. He's buying snacks for our study group. Blake nodded, pleasantly surprised. That's great. Good luck with your studies. As he walked away, Blake felt a sense of pride. He had turned what could have been a confrontational situation into a positive interaction. At the precinct, Blake noticed his fellow officers discussing a recent arrest. He overheard comments that made him uncomfortable, remarks that echoed his own former biases. Taking a deep breath, he joined the conversation. Hey guys, he said, his voice slightly shaky, have any of you considered taking that anti-bias training program? It really opened my eyes to some things. His colleagues looked at him with surprise. Officer Johnson, a veteran on the force, scoffed. Come on, Blake, we don't need that touchy-face stuff. Blake stood his ground. I thought the same thing. But it's not what you think. It's about being better officers, serving our community more effectively. As he spoke, Blake saw curiosity replaced skepticism in some of his colleagues' eyes. Officer Rodriguez, a newer recruit, spoke up. I've been thinking about signing up. Maybe we could go together. Blake smiled, feeling a glimmer of hope. That'd be great. I'd be happy to go with you. Over the next few weeks, Blake continued to encourage his fellow officers to participate in the training. He shared his experiences, both the uncomfortable realizations and the positive changes he'd seen in his work. Slowly but surely, more officers began to show interest. Blake's enthusiasm was infectious, and his genuine transformation was hard to ignore. Even Officer Johnson, initially dismissive, begrudgingly agreed to attend a session. As Blake watched his colleagues sign up for the training, he felt a sense of accomplishment. He knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but every small step mattered. He thought back to that fateful day with Judge King and realized how far he'd come. Blake's journey was far from over, but he was committed to the path of growth and understanding. He knew that by continuing to challenge his own biases and encouraging others to do the same, he could play a part in creating a fairer, more just system for everyone. Weeks turned into months, and the anti-bias training continued to have a profound impact on Officer Blake. He found himself embodying the lessons he had learned, striving to be a well-educated officer without biases. Every day he made conscious efforts to approach his work with a fresh perspective. One afternoon, Blake responded to a call about a disturbance in a local park. As he arrived on the scene, he saw a group of people arguing loudly. In the past, he might have rushed in, making quick judgments based on appearances, but now he took a moment to assess the situation calmly. Blake approached the group with an open mind. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Officer Blake. Can someone tell me what's going on here? A woman with graying hair stepped forward. Officer, these young people are playing their music too loud. It's disturbing the peace. Blake nodded, acknowledging her concern. Then he turned to the group of young adults. And what's your side of the story? A young man with dreadlocks spoke up. We're just having a small gathering, officer. We didn't realize the music was bothering anyone. Instead of immediately siding with one group, Blake took a deep breath. He remembered Judge King's words about the importance of listening to all sides. I appreciate both of you sharing your perspectives. Let's see if we can find a solution that works for everyone. Over the next few minutes, Blake facilitated a conversation between the two groups. He suggested compromises like lowering the music volume and setting a reasonable end time for the gathering. To his surprise and satisfaction, both parties agreed to the terms. As Blake walked back to his paddle car, he felt a sense of accomplishment. He had resolved the situation without making assumptions or escalating tensions. It was a small victory, but it meant a lot to him. Back at the precinct, Blake's changed approach didn't go unnoticed. His fellow officers began to seek his advice on handling difficult situations. Even Officer Johnson, who had been skeptical at first, came to him for guidance. Hey Blake, Johnson said one day, looking a bit uncomfortable. Remember that situation you handled in the park last week? I've got something similar coming up. Any tips? Blake smiled, touched by his colleague's willingness to learn. Sure thing, Johnson. The key is to listen to everyone involved and look for common ground. Let me walk you through it. As Blake shared his insights, he realized how far he'd come. He was no longer just changing himself. He was helping to change the entire department. It wasn't always easy, and he knew there was still a long way to go, but Blake felt proud of the Progress he and his fellow officers were making several months after his transformative experience. Officer Blake stood at the podium in the community center, his heart racing with nervous excitement. The room was packed with local residents and fellow police officers all gathered for the community forum he had organized. Blake took a deep breath and began to speak. Good evening everyone, I'm Officer Blake and I want to thank you all for coming tonight. This forum isn't just about building bridges between the police and our community, it's also about personal growth and the power of change. His voice trembled slightly as he continued. Many of you may remember an incident several months ago right outside the courthouse. I made a terrible mistake that day, one born from my own biases and assumptions. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded, recognizing the event he was referring to. I confronted a woman I assumed didn't belong there simply because of how she looked. That woman turned out to be Judge Marita King, and her grace in that moment changed my life forever. Blake's eyes scanned the audience, noticing Judge King herself sitting quietly in the back row. She offered him an encouraging nod. I was wrong that day, deeply wrong, Blake admitted, his voice thick with emotion. But Judge King didn't just reprimand me, she opened my eyes to my own prejudices and gave me a chance to learn and grow. He went on to describe the anti-bias training he'd undergone and how it had transformed his approach to policing. I learned that true justice isn't about quick judgments or assumptions, it's about listening, understanding, and treating every person with dignity and respect. As Blake spoke, he could see the impact his words were having. Some audience members wiped away tears while others nodded in agreement. Even some of his fellow officers, initially skeptical of the forum, seemed moved by his candor. I stand before you today not as a perfect officer but as someone committed to doing better, Blake continued. I'm here to listen to your concerns, to understand your experiences, and to work together to build a safer, more just community for all of us. His voice grew stronger as he concluded, change is possible. I'm living proof of that, but it takes honesty, humility, and a willingness to confront our own biases. I hope my story can be a starting point for all of us to have these difficult but necessary conversations. As Blake finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. Many in the audience stood moved by his heartfelt words and evident transformation. Some of those present at the courthouse incident months ago shared looks of surprise and approval, seeing the profound change in the once biased officer. As the applause died down, Blake stepped away from the podium, his heart still racing. He scanned the crowd, his eyes landing on Judge Marita King. She was making her way towards him, a warm smile on her face. Officer Blake, Marita greeted him, extending her hand. That was quite a speech. Blake shook her hand, feeling a mix of nervousness and gratitude. Judge King, I'm so glad you could make it. Your presence means a lot to me. They moved to a quieter corner of the room away from the bustling crowd. Blake took a deep breath, gathering his courage. Judge King, he began, his voice filled with sincerity, I want to thank you again. You opened my eyes that day. I never knew how much I had to learn. Marita's eyes softened as she listened to Blake's words. She could see the genuine change in him, a far cry from the defensive, biased officer she had encountered months ago. I'm proud of you, Officer Blake, Marita said, her voice warm and encouraging. You've come a long way since our first meeting. It takes real courage to confront our own biases and work to change them. Blake felt a lump form in his throat at her words. Your kindness that day, even in the face of my ignorance, it changed everything for me. I couldn't stop thinking about how wrong I was, how fair I'd been. Marita nodded, understanding the weight of his realization. Growth often starts with uncomfortable truths, Officer Blake. What matters is what we do with that knowledge. I'm trying my best to make a difference, Blake said, gesturing to the form around them, to help others see what I've learned, but I know I still have a long way to go. We all do, Marita replied gently. The journey towards true equality and justice is ongoing, but every step forward, every mind changed, brings us closer to that goal. In the weeks following the community forum, Blake's speech and personal transformation became a catalyst for change within the police department. His story spread quickly, inspiring both officers and community members alike. Chief Johnson, the head of the department, called Blake into his office one morning. Blake entered nervously, unsure of what to expect. Officer Blake, Chief Johnson began, his voice serious but not unkind, your recent actions have caught the attention of the entire force. I must say I'm impressed with your growth. Blake nodded, feeling a mix of pride and humility. Thank you, sir. I've learned so much these past few months. Chief Johnson leaned forward, his eyes intense. We want to make some changes in the department, Blake, and we'd like your help. Over the next hour they discussed PL plans to implement more inclusive practices within the force. Blake's heart swelled with hope as he realized the impact his journey could have on the entire department. In the following months, the police department underwent a significant transformation. Regular anti-bias training sessions became Mandatory for all officers with Judge Marita King often invited as a guest speaker. Blake took an active role in these changes. He worked closely with the training department to develop new programs that addressed implicit biases and promoted cultural understanding. His first-hand experience made him a powerful advocate for change. Remember, Blake would often say to his fellow officers during training sessions, "We're here to protect and serve everyone. Our biases can blind us to the truth and prevent us from doing our jobs fairly." As the changes took root, the atmosphere within the department began to shift. Officers started to approach their work with more empathy and awareness. Community relation improved with more positive interactions between police and resident. Blake's role expanded beyond just training. He became a mentor to new recruits, sharing his story and guiding them towards a more inclusive approach to policing. His openness about his past mistakes and his journey to overcome them resonated with many young officers. One day, as Blake was leaving the precinct after a long shift, he ran into Officer Harris, who had reported his behavior months ago. Blake Harris called out, jogging to catch up with him. "I just wanted to say I'm really impressed with what you've done. The changes you've helped bring about, they're making a real difference." Blake felt a warmth spread through his chest. "Thanks, Harris, that means a lot coming from you. I'm just glad I could turn my mistake into something positive." As they walked together discussing the recent changes in the department, Blake felt a sense of purpose he'd never experienced before. He knew there was still much work to be done, but he was committed to continuing on this path, helping to shape a more just and fair environment within the force. Marita sat in her chambers, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of her judicial robe. The late afternoon sun streamed through the window, casting a warm glow across her desk. She closed her eyes for a moment, reflecting on the events of the past few months. Her encounter with Officer Blake outside the courthouse that day had been a pivotal moment, not just for him but for the entire community. Marita had seen many cases of injustice throughout her career, but rarely had she witnessed such a profound transformation in an individual. As she opened her eyes, her gaze fell upon a newspaper clipping on her desk. The headline read, "Local Police Department Implements Groundbreaking Anti-Bias Training." A small smile played on her lips as she remembered the community forum where Blake had shared his story. Marita's phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was a message from the police chief thanking her for her continued support and involvement in their training programs. She felt a surge of pride knowing that her efforts were making a real difference. Rising from her chair, Marita walked to the window and looked out at the city below. She could see the courthouse steps where it had all begun. Now those same steps were often the site of community gatherings and open dialogues between law enforcement and residential. Who would have thought? Marita mused aloud that one tense moment could lead to so much positive change. She thought about the cases she had presided over. Since then there had been a noticeable shift in the way officers presented evidence and testified in court. They seemed more aware of their own biases and more careful in their judgments. Marita's role had expanded beyond the courtroom as well. She found herself frequently invited to speak at community events, policing, and even national conferences. Her message of justice, equality, and the importance of recognizing and overcoming biases resonated with people from all walks of life. As she turned back to her desk, Marita's eyes fell on a framed photo. It was from the most recent graduating class of the police academy. In the center stood Officer Blake, now a respected mentor, surrounded by a diverse group of new recruits. The image filled her with hope for the future. Marita sat back down, picking up her gavel and holding it thoughtfully. She realized that her role as a judge was about more than just interpreting the law. It was about inspiring change, fostering understanding, and helping to build a more just society. The following day the sun shone brightly on the community park where a large crowd had gathered for the annual Unity Day celebration. Colorful banners fluttered in the gentle breeze and the air was filled with the sounds of laughter and cheerful conversation. At the center of it all stood Judge Marita King and Officer Blake, their presence a testament to how far they'd come. Marita looked out at the sea of faces before her, a beautiful mix of races, ages, and backgrounds. She felt a warmth in her heart knowing that this gathering was in part a result of the changes she and Blake had helped bring about. Blake stood tall beside her, his posture relaxed and confident. Gone was the narrow, biased young officer he had once been. In his place stood a man who had learned from his mistakes and was committed to making a difference. "I never thought I'd see a day like this," Blake said softly, his voice filled with wonder. Marita smiled, patting his arm gently. "Sometimes the most beautiful changes come from the most unexpected places," she replied as they watched children played together on the grass, their laughter echoing across the park. Nearby, a group of police officers chatted amiably with local residents, sharing stories and building bridges of understanding. Blake's eyes misted it over as he took in the scene. Judge King, he began, his voice thick with emotion, I can't thank you enough for what you did that day, Your Grace, it changed everything. Marita shook her head, her expression warm. You did the hard work, Blake, you chose to learn and grow, that's what truly made the difference. A young girl approached them, her bright eyes filled with admiration. Are you the judge and the officer from the story, she asked shyly. Blake knelt down to her level, smiling. We are, he said. What's your name? Lily, she replied. I want to be a police officer when I grow up. I want to help people like you do. Blake's heart swelled with pride and responsibility. He glanced up at Marita, who nodded encouragingly. That's one wonderful, Lily, Blake said. Just remember, the most important thing is to always keep learning and to treat everyone with kindness and respect. As Lily skipped away, Marita and Blake exchanged a look of understanding. They had come so far, yet there was still work to be done, but standing there surrounded by the fruits of their efforts, they knew that change was possible, one person at a time, one moment of grace at a time. They were building a better world. The Unity Day celebration continued around them, a living symbol of hope, redemption, and the power of empathy to transform lives and communities. If you enjoyed the story of Officer Blake and Judge Marita, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.